Thank you all for coming. Thank you to those in the room and to those online for joining us today. I'm Eileen Ellsworth, President and CEO of the Community Foundation for Northern Virginia. And I am joined here today by Dr. Terry Clower, Director of George Mason University's Center for Regional Analysis. I'm also joined by Dr. Keith Waters, Assistant Director at the Center for Regional Analysis and at the Stephen S. Fuller Institute, and Sari Raskin, Vice President for Grants and Community Leadership at the Community Foundation for Northern Virginia. And today we are going to discuss the economic impact of workforce mental health on the region. As many of you know, the Community Foundation's been focusing on this for the past 2 years. We've spent the better part of the past 2 years writing about and discussing in various community forums the extent of mental health issues across Northern Virginia. We issued a report in March of 2022 on the mental health of our adults in the region, and we issued a second report on the mental health of our children and youth in February of 2023. Today's report was co-issued about a month ago. Actually, we published it a month ago by Insight Region, the Community Foundation Center for Community Research, and by the Center for Regional Analysis at George Mason University. You know, we do nothing alone at the Community Foundation. We've said that many times, and we were absolutely delighted to partner with Terry and Keith on this project. We were looking at workforce productivity loss as a result of the mental health issues in 2022, and we wondered what impact that might have had on the economy. Well, none of us at the Community Foundation are economists, but Terry and Keith are. So we thought it might be a good idea to partner with them. We kept asking ourselves internally, what's the number? What's the economic loss to the region as a result of all of this workforce loss? And we have that number for you today. And in arriving at that number, the researchers on this project developed a novel methodology to measure that loss. And Terry and Keith are going to share that with you shortly. We are going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So please write your questions on the note cards near your seat, hand them to one of our colleagues. If you're on Zoom today, please send the question through the Q&A box. So let's get started with a data-driven look at worker mental health across Northern Virginia. All right, as the bar chart on this slide demonstrates, and this data is from just the first half of 2023, so it's very recent data, 58% of our workers, of all of our workers in Northern Virginia, reported feeling tense, nervous, or on edge. 45% also reported unstoppable worry. 40% represented feeling down, hopeless, or depressed. And another 40% say they lost interest or pleasure in something they once enjoyed. A majority of our workers now suffer from some form of mental health issue. Are these percentages high compared to recent history? Yes, indeed, they are. They are very high. So take a look at the bar chart here on this slide. So in 2019, as you can see, only 18%, the number at the top there, only 18% of workers in Northern Virginia reported these feelings. That's 1/3 of today's numbers. And the majority of those workers fell into the mild range. So on this bar chart, light blue is mild and dark blue is clinical. So as you can see in 2019, most of the workers that reported an issue were in the mild range. But things shifted very rapidly during the pandemic. Look at 2020, the next bar, just 1 year later. The rate tripled from 18% to 57%. And note, in particular, a much larger percentage of those workers are now in the severe clinical range of symptoms, as opposed to the mild range. Look at 2021, some improvement year over year. Actually, totals go from 57% to 52%. And in 2022, we hold steady at 52%. But as the previous slide showed you, today we're back up to 58%. So we went from 18 to 57 to 52 to 52, and today 58%. In fact, if given a diagnostically valid screener today, 1 in 4 of all Northern Virginia workers would be referred to a therapist for a formal diagnosis and treatment of clinical anxiety and depression. So what is the impact of all this? During the pandemic, you may recall some people left their jobs. Now, this happened to coincide with mental health declines, but we're not saying that's necessarily related. We called it the Great Resignation. But most people stayed. They stayed on their jobs. They remained employed. And some national research shows that workers with mental health needs who stayed struggled with both absenteeism and presenteeism. Now, absenteeism, we all know what that means, right? That's a term we're all familiar with. You physically don't show up for work. But presenteeism may be a term that's new to you. It means you are physically present, but much less productive. You're procrastinating, you're losing interest, avoiding colleagues, missing deadlines, and behaving in other troubling or disruptive ways. How do these behavioral changes impact workforce productivity and ultimately our local economy? Dr. Keith Waters is going to help us answer that question now.
All right. So what we went ahead and did with the Community Foundation is we delved into the literature and we looked for estimates of absenteeism and presenteeism and productivity losses associated with those directly. And one of the things that we absolutely wanted to incorporate, which was found in the literature, is the fact that as mental health issues become more severe, the productivity losses also become more severe. This really shouldn't be like a groundbreaking idea, but it's well supported in the literature that as you go from sort of no mental health issues to more severe mental health issues, your productivity losses become more severe. You miss work more, and then your presenteeism issues become more severe. However, one thing that what we've done is we've taken productivity losses associated with the severity of the mental health issues, but then we've adjusted them for two things. The first thing that we've adjusted these estimates for are the fact that for presenteeism, you are at work, right? And so you will have reduced output. And we've really tried to adjust as well as we can for the fact that you are at work, you are still producing. So even though you're having presenteeism issues while you're at work, you are still doing something. So you are being somewhat productive while you're at work. On that note, this is actually quite a difficult thing to measure. The work output that you do while you are at work is going to be highly contingent on the field that you're in, right? So if you're producing widgets, if you're making cups, it's very easy to measure the output of the things that are coming out, right? But if you're in the if you're in the professional and business services sector, that's much more difficult to measure what it is you would produce, right? That's a very difficult thing to measure what you should be producing on each day. So what we've gone ahead and done is say, okay, you're at work, and we've incorporated some estimates that are specifically discussed as work output scores, and this actually asks people directly while you are having presenteeism issues, kind of what is the level of sort of your usual output that is being missed. So we've gone ahead and adjusted for the fact that basically, folks are going to be having a bunch of that across industries, outputs, basically output varies. So that's the first thing that we've done. The second thing that we've done that we've adjusted for is actually the output loss for both presenteeism and absenteeism on the fact that your colleagues can actually pick up some of the slack, right? If you miss work because, your kid gets sick and you have to stay home. This isn't necessarily a mental health issue, but if you miss work for whatever reason, your colleagues can pick up some of the slack. So actually, the fact that you've missed work or you're at work doesn't necessarily immediately reduce the total output of an individual firm. So we've actually delved into the literature on that particular front, and we've adjusted for the output loss specifically relating to that. And so, when you stack up absenteeism, presenteeism, and then sort of just typical work loss, which is we've kind of defined as mild, and then we adjust for these two things, which are going to be the fact that you are at work and you're still producing. And then the second thing is that your colleagues can pick up some of the slack. Mental health, we come up with a range of productivity losses specifically related to mental health in the range of 5 to 13%. And so then what we do with these productivity losses regarding mental health issues is that we apply it to Northern Virginia specifically. There are some data from the US Census Bureau. They've been doing this, what's called the Pulse survey since the outset of the pandemic. And they actually have, and so this is actually where the mental health information regarding the folks in Northern Virginia come from. But then they also ask, what industry do you work in? And then other questions, how old are you and this type of stuff. And so what we've done is we've taken these productivity losses per worker, and we've applied them to our labor force here in Northern Virginia. Okay, and so in 2019, we've estimated that the GRP, so the gross regional product, this is the regional sort of corollary to gross domestic product, would have been $2.1 billion higher in 2019 if folks with mental health, if they just had the same absenteeism and presenteeism issues as folks with no mental health, right? So we're not getting rid of absenteeism and presenteeism generally. We're just bringing the folks who have mental health issues up to this level that's, these levels of absenteeism and presenteeism that are sort of like generally sort of, happening in society. As Eileen showed you, between 2019 and 2020, we had a spike in mental health issues, basically induced by the pandemic. Everybody started panicking about various things. The virus itself, jobs, what are you going to do with your kids? What do you do with your elderly parents? These types of things. So with that spike in mental health issues, you're going to have a spike in productivity losses because people are less productive at work. They're missing work more. Okay, and so what we've estimated is that the lost output jumped from 2.1 billion in 2019 to 8 billion in 2020, and then continues to grow to 8.3 billion and 8.4 billion respectively in 2021 and 2022. What I will say though is between the percentages is coming down. Okay, so the percentages is coming down. Unfortunately, these numbers are somewhat worse at the Commonwealth. So if we look at the Commonwealth as a whole, those percentages are a little bit higher at 3.6%, 3.4%, and then again at 3.6%. While between 2021 and 2022, mental health issues in the region improved somewhat. That's not true at the Commonwealth as a whole. And so what we actually see is the productivity losses regarding mental health impacts increased quite a bit more between 21 and 2022 at the Commonwealth level. So this is a loss of $21.8 billion. These sound like massive numbers, right? But if you just, the fraction is quite small. So a small percent of a really big number is going to be a really big number. Okay. And I will say this, at this moment in time, is that no matter how we looked at this, mental health is a pretty prevalent issue. So, we have tried our best to make these estimates fairly conservative, not to overstate the problem. And no matter how much you try to be conservative regarding sort of the prevalence of mental health, it clearly has a massive impact on our region's economy. Breaking it out by industrial sector, so these are the various sectors, it should come as no surprise that the sector that is most highly impacted is going to be professional and business services sector, with losses. Well, we could have had an additional $2.3 billion in output in Northern Virginia, just in the professional and business service sector alone. This should be no surprise because it is, of course, our largest economic sector. Other ones with large losses include trade, transportation, utilities, as well as government. When you look along the side there, actually trade, transportation, and utilities actually had the largest percentage loss. So with that, I will actually, so broadly speaking, massive losses regarding the impact of mental health. We could have notably higher economic output, with even minor improvements to mental health in the region. So with that, I will actually hand it off to Sari.
So thank you, Keith, for I think some very surprising and large numbers. So I think I'm here to just talk about why do many of us struggle with mental health issues. And traditionally, Traditionally, mental health is viewed as an individual need requiring an individual response. But poor mental health is now, as we all know, a community-wide issue impacting over half of our workforce. That requires a community-level response and a private sector response. Chronic exposure to multiple stressors and a diminished ability to cope contribute to why of this mental health crisis. First, exposure to multiple stressors. When stressors stack, mental health declines. A team of researchers at Boston University, Brown, and Harvard sorted individuals into 3 groups based on the number of stressors in their lives. Things like, and these are all probably very common to everyone in this room, things like strained relationships, financial insecurity, and loss of routine. The greater number of objective stressors, the more likely you are to struggle. Our report divides some of the stressors that workers face into 2 groups: burnout at home and burnout at work. 43% of US workers experience burnout, a state of emotional exhaustion, low self-fulfillment, and depersonalization. Burnout at home happens when we attempt, all of us, to balance work with our other life roles, being a parent, caregiving for children, caregiving for parents, a financial provider, being a student. Our workers are carrying a very great load of stacked stressors. Coupled those stacked stressors with a diminished ability to just cope. The CDC estimates that 37% of adults in Northern Virginia don't get enough sleep. And if I can ask us a moment, 7 hours is a recommended amount. How many of you had 7 hours of sleep last night? Be honest. Okay. And so the reality is that deprivation hits at around 6 hours or less. And a typical workday, of course, includes 11 to 13 hours of screen time. And imagine if you're a remote worker, there's screen time for work, and then all day, probably constantly in front of the screen. And then when you're self-caring, looking at your screen as well, you're adding more hours to that time as well. And some research, which I know no one is surprised by, shows that social media screen time contributes to anxiety and depression. Given the extent of loss of workforce productivity as a result of mental health issues and its impact on economic loss, question is, what can we do? A region like Northern Virginia that focuses on access to and affordability of mental health can position itself as having a more competitive workforce. And the private sector can implement more employee supports and changes to the workforce culture to improve performance. In fact, employers that were able to manage the time, talent, and energy of their teams during the pandemic grew 5 to 8% more productive and saw more productivity post-pandemic as well. So they dedicated that time and it proved to be beneficial. Employers able to cultivate good employee mental health also have a tremendous opportunity to increase productivity and their own economic competitiveness. We offer a checklist on page 9 of the report, which you have in front of you, in Figure 7 that can be used to help employers assess the extent to which policies and procedures can support the mental health of their workforce. And as you can see, there are a few examples here that are in the report. One is promote fair and effective management practices. Another is provide employees with professional growth opportunities, provide mental health training to management or staff, and strategize to how to promote mental health awareness and resources so that they're readily available to your employees. So there are additional suggestions also as well. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Terry Clower, who will give us some more information, and then which will be followed by a Q&A. Terry.
Thank you very much. So what my task here is just to put a little broader context on this. And one of the things that if you think about what we're looking at, I'm reminded of a couple of things. So, somebody once said in talking about congressional, budget negotiations that $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about some real money. And, and we were thinking about this, and I don't make light of this, but I want to put it into context of one thing. So we're talking about an $8 billion impact on affecting the economy. Now, has anybody heard of this little thing we have in the region called Amazon HQ2? Was there a little bit of hype around Amazon HQ2? And certainly rightfully so. Amazon HQ2 projections, some of them that have been done by some of our colleagues, talk about a $1.5 billion impact. So imagine that what we're talking about is 4 to 5 Amazon HQ2's worth of lost productivity. And I really have to commend my colleague Keith and people and staff at the Community Foundation, because when we first did this, Eileen calls me and says, we're looking at this and they're talking about, some of these people are talking about 45% productivity loss. And I've been a manager for a long, long time now of staff. And, there's a little bit of time that you can tolerate that, but at some point you're having to, unfortunately, let that person go if they're not that productive. The team will cover a little bit, but then you start ramping up the stress on the team and you lose it. So what we have are loss here. And we're talking about the potential of losing workers in this region. Folks, I'm going to tell you that we are challenged in this region by one key thing: labor availability. We are, for the last decade or so, have been trailing the nation in overall growth in this region. And a lot of it is just because we don't have enough workers in the system. I would argue to you that in part maybe helps explain some of the stressors that we have in the workplace, because we have all this. So Eileen mentioned a thing that, remember that thing that we saw in the pandemic called quiet quitting? Most of us, I would argue, probably experience what I call quiet hiring. All of a sudden, I've got more job. I've got another title than I used to have. Keith has 2 titles now. Did we get a pay raise for this? Oh, no, we were told, good job, guys, keep going, right? So that quiet hiring is more of what we're seeing in practice. And so I think it's one of these things of two that I want to, this is really important for us. And what we're really having is that these stressors, to address them, are going to require multiple types of solutions. And some of it is going to be through mental health services, helping folks, one, get over still the stigma that you have in there, particularly of folks that look more like my hairline than others, of accepting help. But it's really addressing that. But then some of it are things that we don't have direct control of. Cost of living in this region is certainly a challenge. The cost of childcare, elder care, the availability. An interesting stat, the biggest rise that we've seen in workforce participation recently has been women returning to the workforce. Our labor force participation rate for women is higher than it's ever been. And I would argue to you that that is not a matter of chasing opportunity. It is a matter of financial necessity for most households. Somebody once said to me the other day, they was talking about the inflation measures. And of course, in fact, while we're sitting here, we're getting new CPI numbers, but saying that, well, inflation's not that bad if you take housing, energy, and food out of those volatile sectors. Like, yeah, if you take what people have to spend money on, it's not bad, right? So, we can't necessarily address that directly, but there are things that we need to do to address this. And what I'm going to suggest to you is the investments in this. I'm using the word investments. and that we can expect a return on that investment as businesses, as organizations, and as a general public in starting to address the services that we need to help our folks, our workers, be able to deal better with these stressors. And now some of it is we can do things that actually help some of those stressors, but some of them are macroeconomic, global economic things that we can't try. I mean, the stuff that happened last weekend, that creates stress for some folks. Anybody who's thinking about it, those kind of things happening in our world create stress and just adds a little on the top. So it is that matter of addressing these things. And what I would argue to you, we did not take this and, know which ones are going to, but businesses that will invest in their workers will see a return in the form of higher productivity. We'll see a return in the form of less absenteeism and less people having to leave because of their mental health challenges. Just right now, for those of you who do it, how hard is it to recruit and onboard new employees now? And that's not getting any better. We've got a little bit of a baby bust going on in our population dynamics now, and of course, we still don't have sane immigration policy. So we're having a challenge in that workforce. The other thing that I would argue to you is that this is a scale of thing like we think of in terms of massive infrastructure projects where public-private partnerships need to be engaged to do it. Now, why should we talk about employing tax dollars on this? Is I will tell you it's about regional economic competitiveness. If we in this region were to come together, our localities, our states, and we were to, with businesses and with the private and the nonprofit sector as well, obviously, is come up with some solutions where we are providing collectively, do it collectively, bring down the average cost of providing some of these services. And if we would do that, we would see that our economy would be more productive, our workforce would be more productive, and having a productive workforce is going to attract investment from elsewhere. And it self-perpetuates that, and it helps us to grow. So what I am telling you is that the reason that this is an important thing to pay attention to and to start advocating for some collective action is our regional economic competitiveness and our ability to address these issues. Because imagine what is the cost of society when you lose that person who can't function at the office anymore. They become instead of a net producer of economic activity, they are a consumer only of resources. And we need them actually in the workforce being productive. So with that, I think that makes that point. So let's turn it to questions.
Well, I'll just say, this is music to our ears at the Community Foundation in the sense that we're not just talking to the social sector. We're talking to the private sector about the impact of what is sometimes siloed into a social sector issue. It's not. What's good for the private sector is good for the residents of Northern Virginia, yes? So I think it's time that the region stops thinking about a bright line between sectors and starts doing more of what Terry is recommending. That we need to come together around shared solutions for these big issues. Okay, so I have a couple of questions in my hand from the audience that's here. And the first is, and this is definitely for Terry and Keith, do you have any stats or other information on the number of employee assistance programs that are available or in place in Northern Virginia in the workforce?
I am not aware of any stats on that.
There are some that come in. Some of these get counted in overall benefits. Employee assistance programs. Now, the question is the direction of that employee assistance program, because a lot of those, what get funded by companies are more focused on dependency issues as opposed to general mental health. And so I would say we do have some data because it gets counted by some of the measures in the Bureau of Labor Statistics about the cost of benefits that are provided. But in terms of separating out, it would be really interesting to see how those EAP programs have shifted over time to broaden out beyond just dependency and some of those types of issues and more into the general of how do we deal with the fact that we have 3 screaming kids at home and no daycare to send them to.
All right. Why the variation between the stats regarding the Commonwealth as a whole and Northern Virginia? What is your thinking around why there's such a greater impact Commonwealth-wide on loss of workforce productivity than there is in Northern Virginia?
So just as a matter of sort of data, sort of statistical thing is, the mental health rates that are measured in the census pulse that was set up in the wake of the pandemic, those continue to rise in the Commonwealth as a whole, whereas in Northern Virginia, they started to fall. So what we see is this sort of very slow decline in the rates of, mental health issues as measured by the pulse in Northern Virginia, but not the rest of the Commonwealth. There's a bunch of reasons that could be the case. But my sort of overall suspicion is just generally, the more productive economy up here generally kind of soothes a lot of people's anxieties as opposed to elsewhere in the Commonwealth, but that's not necessarily the case. So there's a lot of underlying reasons why that could be the case.
I would argue there's probably 2 things. One is a little bit of the structure in the sense of remember that some of our many parts of the Commonwealth of Virginia have been under economic stress for a long time. The loss of jobs in extractive industries and things like that with little opportunity. So I think that some of that downturn might have hit them a little harder. The other is the clear, Eileen talked about a bright line. One of our brightest lines that we have in this state is once you get outside of the major metropolitan centers of this area, so you think about here, Richmond, Hampton Roads, the availability of any healthcare service drops dramatically. There is literally little option for any mental health services for many of these folks in their communities that's anywhere nearby. And therefore, I'd say that one is maybe it's worse in the Commonwealth because we're just seeing that, at least in this region, there are people who are counselors. There are somebody that you can talk to. And there are many parts of our state where that just simply doesn't exist. And you see it in mental health, you see it in dental health, you see it in women's health, that these services just aren't available in some of our more remote communities. So I would attribute that to being a big piece of it. So it's another one of these things that Eileen and I have actually talked about some of those data before. It's been a few years, but it's just as much as we want to see more resources up here, we have to have state policies and state actions that's going to get better health services overall into many parts of our Commonwealth.
Right. All right. Next question. Were you able to disaggregate the Northern Virginia data to see the differences by age, gender, level of income, and race and ethnicity? So I think the question is, does the Household Pulse Survey offer that level of granularity?
It does. So the Household Pulse Survey absolutely has age, race, ethnicity, gender. We did not delve into that. Our primary goal was to come up with an aggregate number, just as a first blush. This is as far as we're aware, this has never been done at the regional level to begin with. There have been a couple other studies that have looked at countries. The best one that I'm aware of was out of Australia. But as far as it's concerned, our primary goal was to just identify the total level. And then in future endeavors, it certainly would be totally feasible to break it out in various other ways.
If we wanted to do a follow-on, to just look at the loss of workforce productivity, those numbers I was presenting, aggregated, disaggregated, I think we could. I think we could, right? It's available.
Those data are available. It would be, and I guess actually to Eileen's point, The prevalence of mental health, that actually is that's reasonably easy to get. Tying that to productivity losses in the economic sector, that would be more difficult because of the two different data sets that we merge. But the prevalence of mental health would be relatively simple to get.
I'll go out on a limb here, though. I would argue to you that based on availability of services, that there would be clear disparities to low income. And because we're talking about low income or minority communities, and then we still have some of the cultural issues to deal with in some of our minority communities about the acceptability of accepting help. So there are many challenges on that. I think our big one, though, is, as Keith said, our biggest was to get this big number to just say, we got to get attention to this program. And that's where, you know, a few $1 billion here or there starts to get some folks' attention. So that was our main goal here. Let's get to that, but then understand, once we identify how we are addressing this, then we start identifying how there are distinctions in the resources needed among different communities.
Do you think the message, Terry, that you and the Stephen Fuller Institute and others have been talking about now for years, this message that we are not competitive regionally as many other places across the country are, that there's this out migration, we're losing workers. Is that message getting traction?
It certainly is getting traction. Thank you very much. There will be an event next week that we're starting a series of events that we're looking at all the issues that we're facing from a competitiveness, but none of them come to the degree to which what it all results in is that we have too many working age families who are saying, I'm done with the region. I'm going to go elsewhere. You know, I'm going to go south. I'm going to go west. I'm going someplace else. And we need to get those, because part of that is if we lose those workers, sooner or later, the companies will follow. What is different now than any time in history is companies go where the labor force is, not the other way around. And you think about some of the stressors we have. How much stress do we have? Think about, so there is a thing in housing called housing stress. If you're having to spend more than 30% of your income on housing, you are technically what we think of as housing stress, housing burdened. Housing stress, that number, that phrasing has changed over the years, but housing burden, which causes financial stress, right? We have folks in our communities who make really good salaries who are technically housing stressed because our cost of housing is just out of sight, right? And that's part of the thing, you know.
In fact, we discussed in January of 2021, the Community Foundation's Insight Region issued a study that said, Northern Virginia, for low-income families, Northern Virginia has the worst housing burden in the country for low-income families. It's worse than San Francisco. It's worse than San Jose, all of the cities. It was a shocking statistic. That's where we are. All right, so this question is connected to that. How could the economic loss affect the average Northern Virginian family or individual? Why would the average family or person care about this loss?
Very simple. It's income. You know, okay. So let's say if you start experiencing severe absenteeism, what is the likelihood of you retaining your job in the long term? Right. And once you have that challenge and you have a bad employment history, you know, right now, you know, the labor market, we got 2.2% unemployment rate, but still under a normal labor market, you'd have trouble finding another job. So it builds up. And of course, I would argue to you that builds upon itself, because you think of if you're experiencing the kind of stress where it's presenteeism, you know, your productivity's falling down. You know that you're not keeping up with the team. You know that people are having to step in. That just builds upon stress itself. But it really all boils down to me. Yes, I focus on the economic. That's why Eileen and I make a good team. She thinks of the people and I think of the right? But in this case, they are directly correlated because all of this is those families, it'd be an interesting study to do, but I don't need to study it to know that if you start having impacts on your work productivity, that will affect your income and that will affect your family's well-being.
I'll add a tiny bit on top of that, that if, if the workers were more productive in and of themselves, they produce more, the state would collect more taxes and then could actually have a better ability to support this. It would improve quality of life generally because you could provide other support. So, state revenue, local revenue on $8 billion, that can go somewhere.
All right, next question. Do you recommend that the social sector and the private sector partner to address this issue, or that the private sector takes the lead and looks to address these issues in-house?
I don't believe that the scale can happen if it's just the private sector. This is why I suggested, and you spoke to the social sector, so I'd say let's add that other one, public sector, into that. That's why I was suggesting that I think the scale of this issue has gotten bigger than what you would expect companies to just be able to do or willing to do either way. But the effective thing is it's going to require true partnership. Where the social sector, I think, comes in is helping with avenues of delivery, messaging, because one of the things is you can make all these services available, but they have to be taken up. And one of our key challenges with basic mental health is taking up the services that are available. So there are distinct roles for each of these. I think the first one to start, though, is for companies in the private sector. In the sense of leadership, it's going to require joint leadership, not one taking lead and the other sitting back up. Oh, well, until the businesses do something about it, we're not. No, it's got to be moving ahead, but moving ahead together. And part of it is going to be the companies looking at saying, what do we have? What are our programs that we allow? What insurance coverage do we have? What are we willing to invest to keep our workers more productive?
Right. Terry, you shared this is off topic a bit, but you shared with us recently that you were a keynote at a COG event, Council on Governments event, and you spent a portion of that keynote talking about the impact of the lack of childcare on the economy. Mm-hmm. Another example of a social issue bleeding into the performance of our local economy. I mean, we're not thinking about this in silos anymore.
Yeah, and Eileen, I'll even extend it one. It's not even just childcare now, because you think about our elder care issues that we're facing, and the cost of elder care is beyond what people, unless you're the chief executive of a very large corporation, you don't have the income to afford just putting both of your parents into full care anymore, right? So and it's an interesting, as a society, we're almost going back 100 years to where you lived with grandma and grandpa, right? Well, now it's grandma and grandpa having to move in with you, and at the same time you're taking care of the 4 and 5-year-old, and oh wow. Isn't that rather scary, right? And you think, and so I think it's it goes beyond it's family care situation. It's how we balance all that. And this is the other one. Economic necessity is, I love the notion of having record high women participation in the labor force, because for too long we've not fully taken advantage of the talent and skills of the women in our workforce, who are obviously prima facie evidence they're better than men, right? All of us guys can acknowledge that. So no, being facetious a little bit there, but the point is that in and of itself is causing some other stressors, because we still rely on women to be elder care and child care. I mean, there are exceptions to it that we know of, but on average, we're talking about that. So yeah, it's one that we need to address from some, and some of it is societal, and we just have to address that, right? We're not going to fix all this. What we need to do is get it, we're not going to get to zero stress and zero, mental health issues in the workforce. But what has happened, the pandemic triggered some things. And part of it now, I would argue, is we've seen productivity loss numbers, and some people are saying, well, it's all because of work from home. Well, no, but there is the challenge now of nobody has been taught in management school how to manage a dispersed workforce. And I was talking to somebody yesterday that was just saying that she has stress at work because she hasn't seen her boss in 4 or 5 months.
I have stress at work because I'm sitting next to my boss.
That's a different one. I'm used to the idea if I walk in the office, somebody says, why are you here? Go out and find some money to keep us working, But but the point is that, I would tell you, we will have an elevated because the nature of work has changed. It's not going back, and we have to figure out how to do it. And it's not the employee's responsibility, it's management's responsibility to figure that out. But there are going to be increased. I think our best case scenario is, even with these services, we're at an elevated level while we try to figure out this new way of working.
Yeah, I mean, three times the loss of workforce productivity today than in 2019. That's huge.
Yes.
All right, this question, I think, is talking about what a company does when the community just doesn't have the kind of help that is needed. So the question is, what recommendations do you have for people in the places that severely lack adequate mental health and other healthcare services? In other words, the community's falling down on the job, but you're an employee and you have healthcare needs. So who picks up that slack? Really, it's a question of what are we really saying about what companies in those kinds of communities need to do if they want to keep and attract a workforce and keep it healthy and productive and well?
This is a challenge we're facing from a different perspective. I've mentioned a couple of times dependency issues. If we go into many of our rural communities, the opioid dependency issues have hit 25% of the labor force. And then remember again, I said that companies are choosing where they do business based on the availability of labor. Think of that spiraling effect that you can have there. Well, this is an extension of that. There are folks that have been one of our colleagues, Dr. Bill Hazel, who is now at the Claude Moore Foundation, former Secretary of Health in the Commonwealth. He's been working on that issue of dependency, mental health availability in many parts of that. And I think that this is just an extension of that, of saying that we need more, but we haven't found that solution, and it's resources. And that's why we wanted to concentrate this on why there is a potential return on investment, so that you can talk to state and local leaders that we need to put some money into it. We need to ask the businesses to, and we need to have a message that says there is an economic reason. This is not just you being nice. This is in your own self-interest to invest in solutions.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next question. How would you respond to the critique that framing the importance of mental health in terms of workforce productivity in itself might have a negative impact on mental health? That people are only worth what they produce. Is that what we're saying?
So I'll take this one on. We did focus on the early on in these discussions. There are other costs, and actually we note them. Particularly, I know we note them in our technical appendix on our website. Societal costs, which are going to be public and private spending on healthcare. You're going to have quality of life costs, right? This is things like self-inflicted injuries, premature death, and then you have the economic output losses. So this would be the reduced labor force participation, absenteeism, and presenteeism. So we fully acknowledge that there are other costs associated with mental health issues. This question in particular focuses on those quality of life issues.
We hope that all of you who, if you're here from the private sector, we're thrilled you're here. If you're not, be ambassadors, be out in the community telling people about what you're hearing here and how they should be listening and how we need to come together to solve problems.
All right, and we have time for one more question. It's 9:30. And I kind of like this question as a wrap up. Funding can't be the only answer. How can the community at large help and find a solution?
Here's one of the things, an interesting dynamic. I talked about, how the work from home has changed the way we work and we do all that. And we talk about some companies that are, that are yelling loudest for everybody to come back to the office all the time because of corporate culture and all that kind of stuff. The one thing I kind of wonder is if we're doing more working from home, do we build neighborhood cultures better? If you think about, if we're going in this region where, commutes are never short, no matter what you do, no matter which mode you take, so how much of our day do we spend away from our homes and away from our neighbors? And then when we get home, we got to feed the kids, get them in bed and all that kind of stuff. So how often do you see the neighbors? Well, you kind of wave at each other while you're mowing the yard or you're doing it. I'm of course talking about folks that are in single family detached homes or whatever. But I mean, we have this thing where we're so consumed with our work lives and all that. If we have it to where we're at home more, do we build better chances for neighborhood solutions to some of our collective problems? Having said that, even those require investment, require research to understand how to properly do. And so I see this as what we're calling for is that on a local level and at a state level and at a national level, this is a real clarion call that there are real losses that we're having in our economic performance in our society that are harming people, and that's exhibited through loss of income, loss of productivity. Productivity losses mean loss of business revenue. And we have those losses, and therefore there is good reason and justification for us to, in sense, I almost wonder a little bit about the cooking spaghetti. We need to throw lots of things on the wall and see which ones stick and help, because we don't know what the whole solution is, except that we know that we need to get folks some help. But part of that help is going to be self-help and family help.
All right, we do have time. I'm going to take one more question because I love this question. So, and no one looks like they're anxious to leave. So another 2 or 3 minutes. Okay. Were you able to look into the impact of absenteeism and presenteeism on the mental health of the team that has to pick up the slack, particularly when those issues become sort of chronic and long-term? I think that's a great question.
That is, so we obviously incorporated the some estimates that say this is the productivity and loss of the team. This is something that we went back and forth with a lot. And we ultimately stuck with the simplest answer, partly because the two best studies that we found on this both measured it in the exact or very, very similar ways. That being said, this is something that we discussed quite heavily on when things become, as sort of widespread as they are. If half the team has mental health issues, well, you have a smaller pool of workers that are able to pick up the slack, right? Ultimately, we stuck with the estimate that we found because there are some competing reasons to go the other way. I don't want to bore you to death with quantitative economic studies, but the upshot is because the variation among the ability of team members to pick up slack, and the economic studies that we look at actually acknowledge this, so they do vary. That's, we'll call that future research as academics do. We say that's future research. We'll look at that later. But no, that is absolutely a valid point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think whoever wrote that question has an insight into it, right? If you're picking up the slack for your coworkers, it's okay for a while, but if it just persists, then you burn out. Yep. So it's a difficult, big issue. All right.
That's that quiet hiring I was talking about earlier, right? Yeah. And I think we've all experienced it to a certain degree.
We did not get raises when we got performed.
All right, well, that is our program for today. So I'd like to thank the Center for Regional Analysis, Terry, Keith. I'd like to thank Sari for co-presenting with me. And I'd like to particularly thank all of you here in the room and online for your interest in these topics and coming and listening and sharing and engaging with us. We are very, very grateful to our greater community here. So thank you. See you next time.